Welcome back for another tumble down the horror rabbit hole. We've got part 1 of a hell of a story for you tonight. So mix one, roll one, get comfy, whatever the fuck, and let's get into it. This is the Amazonia Expedition, Part 1, the Terra Natal Valley. I'd always wanted to go on a discovery expedition, something exploratory, uncover a new breed of animal or species of plant, or maybe an evolutionary offshoot, something that had been hidden away like a secret by Mother Nature to be discovered, or not. I'd been shortlisted to lead the Amazonia expedition, which had gone into the Amazon basin in Vale de Javari near the Peru border. They'd been given a route directly from FUNAI, which is Brazil's Indigenous Affairs Department, created to protect the native populations in the interior of the basin. The route we were given led around the 14 known native tribes that had lived untouched for their entire existence in the rainforest. They lived among the dangerous animals, insects, and weather, developing their own forms of naturopathic medicines, from the roots of the wasai tree being ground up to aid in kidney health, to the tuari tree bark used in anti-cancer treatments, to the cordoncillo with its anesthetic properties. The many tribes had discovered the secrets of the Amazon. In fact, the Matsé tribe, who inhabit the border region between Peru and Brazil, had created a 1,000-page encyclopedia of their traditional medicines with the assistance of 5 shamans and a conservation group. The Matsé were doing this because they feared they, as a tribe, were falling into extinction. They may not have thrived, but they did survive. They'd been given help from the government, making them and their portions of the rainforest into protected classes and regions. Heavy fines and even jail time were imposed on outsiders if anyone approached the tiny villages. We could harbor diseases that we'd already overcome with our own immune systems and medicine, which would decimate the tribes. This was particularly ironic, as we were going in looking to find treatments amongst them for our ailments, which they'd already overcome with their immune systems and medicine. The mission was privately funded, which just meant one of the big pharma giants wanted to keep it low-key. This also meant there'd likely be line crossing in different ways. Typically, I didn't like engaging with the possibility of an expedition outside of universities, as the funding would be pulling all the strings and the research would be highly classified. This one was no different, but I applied anyway. It came down to me and Philip Dwyer. Dr. Dwyer was a professor of archaeology, but held doctorates in biology, focusing on mycology and phycology, which is why he was chosen. Not that I wasn't well versed in the topics, but he was a giant in that world, and everyone else was just reflecting in the gleam of his armor. I'd more or less forgotten about the expedition after I'd received the "thanks, but unfortunately" letter, but checked back periodically to see if there was any news of discoveries, which there weren't. In fact, it had been incredibly tight-lipped. That is, until I'd seen Dr. Dwyer's obituary. The cause of death wasn't listed, and I couldn't find anything online. Then I received a phone call, and the answers slowly started presenting themselves. The man on the other end was named Rayburn. He was involved in the preparation and funding of the Amazonia expedition. They were sending another team in and wanted to offer me the position of lead researcher. I said yes before I had a chance to think about it, and plans were made to get me to South America. I was flown to a private airstrip near the Peru-Brazil border, where we drove as far as roads would take us into the rainforest. A camp was set up there for us, where the team had been prepping before descending into the interior. I finally met Rayburn and was able to ask all the questions that had been building up since the phone call. Rayburn explained that a private land mapping organization had been using a series of drones with highly advanced sensor technology to chart the flora of the Amazon and the animals and life that filled it. Certain animals fed on certain insects, which fed on certain plants, which carried certain properties, which were highly beneficial and profitable to Western medicinal corporations. The company had discovered how to chart and make highly accurate predictions on where certain plant species would be found based off this reverse-engineered food chain algorithm. What they had discovered was the Terra Natal Valley and the remnants of a lost civilization rivaling the Mayans. There had been structures detected in the deep gorge, several of which had been carved into the mountain and appeared to continue under the rocky elevation. The last known coordinates of the previous expedition was at the bottom of the valley in what was being referred to as the Morto Interior. That was where we were headed. Finally, I got to ask about Dwyer. Rayburn appeared to have been trying to avoid it. He explained the doctor had been the only one of the previous expedition to make it out of the jungle alive, which was how we had all the information we did, and the information was incredibly promising. Dwyer had made extensive notes in his work journal, but half of them had been burned beyond recognition. When I asked how that happened, Rayburn admitted it was a part of Dwyer's suicide. The doctor was the only member to make it to the city, but within minutes, he'd set himself on fire and everything he had with him. The spine of the notebook and the left half of each page survived. I was allowed to comb through it on the last leg of the drive before we abandoned roads and trails. Dwyer had discovered a new species in the family of Apocynaceae. It was almost identical to the Catharanthus roseus, which is known as the Madagascar periwinkle, bright eyes, and the graveyard plant, among others. There were two main points to the discovery that Dwyer highlighted. The first highlight was the obvious one, and the one he was most excited about. The plant was used to treat leukemia, Hodgkin's and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, advanced stage breast and testicular cancer, as well as diabetes and malaria. It was a juggernaut, but this one species, he claimed, had groundbreaking therapeutic properties, including an insulin-stimulating supercharged vincaline alkaloid. That alone would revolutionize treatments for most, if not all forms of diabetes, possibly even cure it. The second highlight, however, was the vexing one. This plant wasn't found in the Amazon, or anywhere in Brazil, or South America. It's native exclusively to Madagascar, though it can be grown elsewhere ornamentally. A species this distant in its evolutionary track and this far removed from its origin point could not possibly progress to how he was describing. And yet, that's what he'd found. But not just that, dozens and dozens of other species of plants, molds, and fungi. Microbial ecology was a serious interest of mine, and I'd done research papers on how fungi played crucial roles in policing rainforest biodiversity. What I discovered was that fungi prevented the success of any dominant species of closely packed plants by infecting and quickly spreading between them. This would enable a wider range of differing species to flourish. Acting as the main decomposers of ecological systems, growth is the fungi's means of mobility. The more they eat, the more they expand and travel. They also don't require photosynthesis, which means they flourish in some of the most impossible conditions. Dwyer wrote about advanced forms of polyphyletic slime molds, biotrophic mycoparasites, advanced and aggressive flagellates with powerful spore delivery systems, pyrenomycetes and frightening mutations of the Amanita virosa, the Putastroma cornodamae, and giant strains of angel wings and deadly dapperlings. So many of those weren't native to that area or that hemisphere, and wouldn't survive in these conditions. Shouldn't. And yet, Dwyer documented them all. We arrived at the final base camp and met everyone that was going in. There was a small team of mercenaries who'd been hired on to make the trip as safe as possible this time. It was led by a man named Miller, with a jawline like a refrigerator. I hoped I wouldn't have to deal with him often. Rayburn had also brought in twice as many local guides, paying triple what he did the previous group. This was a results-based mission, and had to yield them. We left at dawn on foot, two of the guides leading and the rest carrying large canoes overhead for us. We'd be portaging through several swamps between the lengthy hikes that brought us further into uncharted land, places feet hadn't walked before, deeper than any tribes had gone. Well, not any tribes, not the one they'd supposedly found. I heard bird calls, wings fluttering, animal movements, twigs snapping, growls, grunts, slithering, buzzing, hissing, running water somewhere nearby. At night, the howler monkeys screeched, and the brightly colored tree frogs cackled like witches. And all the while, my own heartbeat was thumping through my ears. And it was hot. So hot. There was also the pungent smell of damp, decomposing trees and decaying vegetation, plants, and shrubbery. The difficulty of walking became evident quickly. The rainforest floor was covered in rocks, fallen trees, brambles, and dead leaves covering the ground under it. Or what might be creeping and crawling just below our feet. The first day, we made it 8 miles into the depths of the rainforest, which was almost half as far as we'd planned. This was all of particular concern, because there had been a storm front detected brewing just off the coast of Lima and was looking to be headed inland. Before we left, there'd been a conversation of whether or not to wait it out, but in this case, money spoke, and everyone agreed. The sounds shifted from morning to day to night, with a rotating chorus of taunting chaos piercing through the jungle. The morning of the third day, we moved to canoes. Miller was told to keep his men on alert, as the waters were filled with black caimans. They were the largest of the crocodilian family, and could grow up to 6 meters in length, and they were violently carnivorous. We took to the shore for the night to sleep, and the mercenaries traded shifts on watch overnight. It was incredibly dangerous, but we were behind in time, and needed to make up for it. The heat and mosquitoes upped their assault on my sanity. You couldn't escape either. That night, a roar of gunfire woke me up. One of the mercenaries, Stevens, was dead. He had an arrow through his throat and had choked on his own blood. Then I saw the other 4 bodies. They were natives, part of the Satir Ma tribe. They appeared to be a twilight hunting party and had stumbled upon our campsite. Stevens must have spooked them, and they put an arrow through his Adam's apple. We didn't know how many more were nearby, but the mercs stayed on high alert for the rest of the night. In the morning, we buried Stevens and left the bodies of the Satir Ma to be claimed either by their tribe or by the jungle. I felt horrible about it, but also frightened. The Satir was an intense tribe and now had a reason to come after us. I'd read stories about them, some firsthand, others passed on from so-and-sos. They had a painful rite of passage for the boys to endure to be accepted into manhood. It involved experiencing the worst pain the jungle has to offer. And this came in the form of the Parapanera clavata, or the bullet ant. It is said to have the most painful sting of any insect. True to its name, the sting is allegedly comparable to being shot with a bullet and can last up to 24 hours. For their manhood ritual, the Satir boy would have 2 gloves filled with bullet ants placed on his hands for no less than 5 minutes. When it was removed, the boy would shake uncontrollably for hours and experience hallucinations, disorientation, and muscle paralysis. To complete the ritual and be accepted as a man by the tribe, the boy would need to endure this practice a total of 20 times over the course of months, sometimes years. And those boys, now grown up into strong, resilient, and deadly shadows in the forest, might be hunting us. Not only that, but we discovered 2 of the guides were gone. Their extra clothes and supplies were still in their sleeping bags, but it looked like they'd been taken in the night. We never found out what happened to them. Back in the canoes, the sounds continued to follow us, like a warning was being sent out to whatever lay ahead. We couldn't tell if the sounds were actual bird calls or from native vocal cords. Then, I saw movement under the boat, in the water below us. Something large, tube-like, scaled. It was a green anaconda, a giant one. Our guides motioned for everyone to raise their paddles out of the water and hold our movements. I watched as the massive snake zigzagged under our canoe, its lengthy body seemingly never-ending. It must be over 40 feet long. Somewhere nearby, there was a splash, then another one, and another. The mercenaries lifted their guns, pointing at the water and tree line, waiting for a target to present itself. Movement caught my peripherals. On the back of the guide in front of me, little feelers poking up. An Amazonian giant centipede. It was crawling up his back towards his long hair, where it would vanish in it. I looked over the edge and saw the anaconda's tail disappear ahead of the canoe, and the water below us settled. I quickly flicked the giant centipede off the guide's back and into the water. It must have been over a foot long and 2 inches thick. We finally made it to the shore and were back on foot for what would be another full day of cutting our way through dense forest. One of the mercenaries went down after being bitten by the musarana. Thankfully, we carried a full pharmacy of antidotes for the vast categories of venom from snakes, spiders, and insects we'd come across. The 4th day, the jungle sounds stopped. It was like someone had pressed the mute button. Animals and insects alike had been prevalent throughout the journey, but at one point, it seemed like they came no further. And shortly after the introduction of silence, we arrived at the Terra Natal Valley. We couldn't see it, of course, as the canopies below blocked it out. An old pathway was discovered carved into the flat rock face of the gorge. It led down the otherwise sheer side of the mountain. We left the canoes above and descended with only the equipment we could carry. It was frightening staring down, following the age-worn stairs as they disappeared into the canopies of dense trees. We dropped below the tree line, and all the terror I'd felt disappeared and was replaced by absolute wonder. I stared down at dozens of small 1 to 2 story structures carved into the side of the rocky decline. Other smaller homes were built out of what appeared to be huge cyclopean blocks of limestone and lined the floor of the valley. So there was a city here. That much from Dr. Dwyer was true. I tried to keep my eyes on the narrowing path ahead of me, but it was impossible not to drift back to the monumental discovery below. The town had a large, straight line across its center, with markings throughout the structures which were built around it. The sunlight was beaming down on one of the markings. I looked up and saw there was a wide opening among the various canopies above. The sunlight found the hole and streaked across the town, following the line from one end to the other. It suddenly occurred to me the tribe had built the structures in that way, creating that line with markings to use the shifting light from above as a sundial to tell time. Fascinating. At the far end of the markings, where the sun disappeared and it signaled dusk had arrived, was what appeared to be the main mountain entrance to whatever was inside, presumably more structures. A half hour into climbing down the mountain path, Miller, who was leading us, stopped and a discussion was had with Rayburn. After a few minutes, we continued forward and I got to see what the issue was. There was a man on the path, clearly a member of the previous expedition. He was laying on his back, dead. A large, frightening protuberance had erupted out of his chest. It looked like a sharp, petrified tree branch with thorns spiking out of the sides. We took turns stepping over him, and it became more unsettling when I noticed the man hadn't been picked apart by animals, insects, maggots, or anything. He was just slowly decomposing, his skin going as white as the growth spewing from his chest. The rest of the walk down, the man was all I could think about. There was another half hour of careful foot placement to go. How had he made it this far? We finally reached the bottom of the path and walked out amongst the structures. They were incredible to witness. They weren't just your common mud huts. They were built with monolithic blocks of solid limestone layered on top of one another. There were colossal rock shapes balancing on others, making Stonehenge look like child's play. I was immediately reminded of the story of a Latvian immigrant who'd built the Coral Castle in Homestead, Florida. He's the only man to claim to know the secret of how the Egyptian pyramids were built, and supported the claim by single-handedly constructing an entire complex of blocks of coral weighing up to 30 tons each in his backyard. Inside the castle walls were numerous puzzles yet to be solved. Though the man had been contacted by universities, engineers, technologists, and even the government, he kept the secrets with him and brought them to his grave. The tribe, whoever they were, had discovered the same principles, methods, and techniques of building these structures. Miller and the mercenaries led us through the town, guns pointed up and into the dark and empty openings of the complexes. It was eerie, with the only sounds in this massive valley coming from us. We made our way down the gorge into the large crevice with the grand, carved entrance. The sunlight was at a point in the sky where it angled into the canopy opening above and through the rocky threshold, lighting far into what appeared to be a massive cavern. We climbed a lengthy staircase with carvings on the kicker plates up to the entryway. We entered through the large, beautifully structured archways into a small hallway. The walls were covered in carvings in multiple languages. Then there were the hieroglyphs, clearly Egyptian, but that was as far as any of us could tell. There were images carved into the ceiling, portraying battles between kings and foreign rulers, gods and men and creatures. The walls were also lined with holders for torches, and every 4 feet, a fire pit. As I admired the artwork and presumed documented history of the tribe, the light reflecting into the hallway began to dim. Leaves blew in, scuttling along the ground, passing us and into the large cavern ahead. Thunder erupted in the distance. The light vanished from the tiny opening in the canopies above as clouds overtook the skies. We were thrown into twilight. The air whipped past us in a chilled breeze and whistled through the massive chamber. The storm was here, and we were about to be pushed into the large caverns for the night. And that concludes part 1 of our adventure into the Amazon basin. To all the mycology and fungi stands out there, my apologies for the butchering of many, if not all, of those words. Come back next Friday night to hear me butcher a few more in the Amazonia Expedition Part 2, The Morto Interior.